What exactly is the focus and goals of your research into raiding? What made you think of the subject in the first place?
The focus and goals of my research is to document and study the world of raiders. I'm doing this by way of an ethnography, which means I'm basically studying the cultural and social behavior and habits of raiders themselves. And of course, I'm focusing my primary area of study in World of Warcraft and that type of raiding. I've been doing this ethnography throughout my PhD research, which began in late 2008. I'm primarily looking at how raiders work together in groups, how they plan strategies to fight bosses, how they improve their performance in an ongoing manner, and how they compete within their groups, their raiding groups, and against other groups. And I'm hoping to see what we can learn about ways groups work together by studying raiders. I became fascinated by raiding when I first got involved in it myself several years ago. I really couldn't believe how a group of 25 people, let alone 10 as well, could actually coordinate together over the internet with different language backgrounds to successfully kill bosses in raid instances. It completely surprised me. I I noticed that they seem to be performing, competing on a level that made me think there's more going on than what you'd ordinarily see in other types of gameplay. It's not just coordinated, it's efficient, it's well thought out, it's well planned, and raiders don't give up easily. So first I wanted to write a book about it. I had finished university and I'd been working in publishing a bit, and I had actually been doing some freelance writing. And so I thought it was a natural fit for me to start writing about it. But as I was trying to do some research into what had been already documented about raiding, there really wasn't anything out there. There was stuff about video games and computer games, and of course all the material about the negative effects of gaming, but there wasn't anything that had been done about raiding. And at the same time, I was seriously looking at doing a PhD. So I thought, well, maybe this is a natural fit. So I wrote up a proposal and submitted it and looked at a few different universities in the UK and was accepted at Durham University to do my PhD. And it all just seemed to fit really well together because my idea was to contribute not just to academic work, which is original research, looking at games, but also trying to give a voice and outlet to this very specialized area of gaming, which I thought needed to be focused on and needed to be talked about. And I think my other plus is the fact that I'm so passionate about what I'm doing. I think it makes the work and the research at this level so much more meaningful and, to be honest, a lot more fun.
How was the research done? Did it take a long time? Were the raiders that participated a good source of data?
The research is actually still underway, although I have completed the bulk of it by now. And I'd say I've probably collected about 18 months worth of data. I guess I'll just outline the various ways I've done the majority of my work. One thing I've done is what's called an ethnography by using participant observation. And this is where I spent about 6 months of my research time documenting the raiding experience from my own perspective and from a group's perspective. I raided with a very understanding guild on an EU server that was doing 25-man raiding at the time. I was documenting what was happening during the raids. I recorded event discussions. I wrote about and listened to the work around raids, what people were doing to prepare for raids, building rep and getting gear and grinding for materials. I got people to take screenshots, to get fraps footage, to talk about how they set up their UIs. I also got people to participate in my blog, which I'll talk about in a moment. I asked lots of questions. I had discussions. I wrote my own reflections as I was going along. They all knew I was doing the research, so everyone would either make fun about it, the fact that, oh, what I just said is going to go into her thesis, or they would try and offer some answers that would be beneficial. It was quite fun and quite interesting. But I have to say, I think it's difficult to do raiding research without doing what I call participant observation, which is observing by participating. You have to do the raiding itself in order to really understand what's going on during a raid. And of course, unless you're doing farm raiding or something of that nature, it's very difficult, I think, to be on a raiding team and just be there watching what's going on. You end up being a 25th member that's just being dragged along for a view. So you have to know how to raid and participate. which was interesting for me because, as you can imagine, when you're trying to do raiding, it's difficult to also wear a researcher's hat and think about what's going on at the same time. It was always a tricky balance for me, and I think that's something that you always have to think about when you do this type of research. I also collected in-game data. This is really the monster of my entire bulk of data. The last time I checked, actually, I was up to about 3,000 or 4,000 pages of raw game data that I've collected. And these data are things like guild chats, whispers, trade chat, party chat, raid chat, anything that seems relevant. Some things I collected I probably didn't need to, but my philosophy at the time was just to gather lots of material and go through it. But it's also very interesting as well because you look over a set period of time and you can see historical shifts in the game and the attitude and interests of the raiders themselves. Sometimes the things that we talk about around raiding can be very interesting as a researcher. For example, if you look at the advertising that can come up on trade chat channels for raiding guilds, you might think it's kind of uninteresting and boring, and maybe you're sick of that particular guild advertising for the 20th day in a row. But I've actually got lots of interesting information there because sometimes the way that we choose to define ourselves by explaining the kind of raiding guild we are and the type of raiders we want in our group can tell us a lot about what we think is important in the raiding culture itself. Another thing I've done, which I just mentioned, is my research blog. This has been very important, actually. And I would say anyone who does online research really needs to have some sort of online presence, like a blog. It's allowed me to have a public voice, and it also has legitimized my own research among raiders because I write it for raiders. I don't write it for anybody else. The blog has also helped me when I want to talk to a group of raiders like an elite raiding guild, but they don't know me. So if I contact them and they check out my blog site and see if I'm worth talking to, it really helps break the ice a little bit. And so far that's been quite successful. I also have a little silly poll I put up there, and people can vote and add comments to my site if they want, although strangely enough people just don't seem to be very busy posting on my site or adding comments. I get very few. I wish people would post more, but at least I know they are visiting. They just don't tend to comment very often. Another big area that I've really taken a lot of information from is by doing interviews, and I do loads of interviews. I've talked to people in groups or individually. I did quite a few originally with the first group I worked with, and I've also done group interviews with elite guilds, with hardcore raiding guilds, and also individual raiders rather. And this has opened up lots of other doors for me. It's probably created opportunities that I had not anticipated before. And for the most part, my success in interviews has really just been about being open and approaching people and seeing if they're willing to talk to me. And so far, I've had the response has been great. People are very happy to talk about what they're doing. And they're very happy, I think, to see a lot of academic work being done about what raiding is and how it works. And I think a lot of us who've been around gaming for a while get a little bit tired of the old way that games get talked about in the media, and I think it's just nice to see that we might be able to give a voice to something that's different. So, or rather, give a different voice to something that's going on.
What have you found out so far?
So what I'm finding out so far with my research is really quite exciting and very compelling. I'd say that there's a few unique things that I think are going on in raiding that need to be communicated, and some things I think will not be a big surprise to any of us who are raiding, but I think would be a bit of a surprise to people who aren't quite as familiar with this world. It's no big surprise to raiders, though. It's a very competitive environment. In fact, for a lot of raiders, the main reason that they continue to raid and endure the progress wipes and all the things that go on is the fact that you get to get something killed, you get the challenge, you work as a group, and it's a very exhilarating feeling. And I think that the level of competition and performance that comes into that sometimes makes this feel more like a team sport than sort of individual play or other types of games that people might ordinarily think of when they think of computer and video games. So that's probably one of the first things. It's just the very nature of raiding is very different from other things. I'm also finding that some of the ways that we communicate with each other and the way that we choose to use the space of a game like World of Warcraft is very different from how other gamers might use the space. Of course, we love questing and we love leveling up on some level, but for us that's really the means to an end. We have to go through all those things in order to get to what we want to do, which is the raiding content. So we become very efficient in how we do things. We efficiently pile up dailies and grind for materials and get our reputation up and things of that nature, just to be able to improve our performance during raids. And so we almost modify the way the game functions in order to be able to raid successfully. And I think that's interesting as well, because it just shows that a game like an MMO, that is what I call persistent gaming environment, allows you to do whatever you want with it. You can be a solo player if you want, and you can just play non-stop, but of course for most raiders that just doesn't appeal. I also think one of the things I'm finding is there are some common features that do come through for raiders, but there is no universal idea. For example, I did a poll recently about PvP on my website, because I was wondering, okay, the most competitive raiders also really into PvP, and that wasn't really the case. Some definitely are, and they love it, and they're quite into the experience of PvP, because it's a very different way of playing your character and playing particular skill set. Others could care less. They'd rather do anything than PvP, and that just, again, and they're just as successful as the other people in raiding, that they just choose not to. So I think even within our own community, we have diversity, we have variation in how we like to do things. I think that's extremely interesting. So I'd say the main things that I'm finding are coming under three main categories, which is performance, coordination, and competition. And what I'm looking at is the various ways that we pursue those ideas within our raiding guilds and also individually. So that's kind of where I'm focused.
Tell us something that surprised you in your research.
As far as what's surprised me in my research, I'd say a couple of things kind of come to mind right off the bat. One, I wouldn't say this is surprising, but the depth to which this is happening is probably what surprised me. And that's the level of loyalty and commitment that raiders have for each other. In some cases, you have raiders who have raided together for 4 or 5 years. They may have never met each other in real life. They may live in completely different areas of the world or across a wide country like the United States. They may have only heard each other's voices by talking on Vent, or maybe not even spoken to each other if they're a raiding guild that uses no audio. They may be totally different ages. They may have different language backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, and yet something keeps them working together. They have formed some kind of a connection that makes it so they don't want to let each other down. They want to be able to be there for each other if the rest of the other 24 people are waiting on them, and they feel this degree of obligation that is truly quite surprising. The other thing that I think is also very interesting, and this came up more recently, I don't know how many of you were following some of the activity during the early progress raiding that was going on between guilds like Insidia and For the Horde and Paragon and others, and one of the members of Paragon had posted a day in his life as an example, and he and I talked about it afterwards, because he'd first put this up because he wanted to show the naysayers out there that raiders, especially elite raiders, aren't necessarily jobless or just students or doing nothing and just sitting around raiding 24/7, that some of them do hold down regular jobs and have obligations, and even though it's very difficult for that short period of time when they're doing the intense progress raiding, they do manage to make it come together, and that's able. And he was actually showing it to show an example that not all raiders are the same, even at elite levels. It caused this intense backlash. There was a lot of different blog posts that people came up with about how raiders have no life, how they're ruining games, how they have no balance, how they're unhealthy, and this was coming from other gamers. This wasn't coming from the media or other types of outlets where people usually jump on the bandwagon of attacking games. No, this was actual other gamers who love games as much as raiders do, but they have decided that there's a hierarchy or there's some sort of layers of value that they place, and that raiders on some level are ruining the game for them, which I'll be honest and say I hadn't really thought this through before. I hadn't realised that there was so much negativity towards raiders, and I would almost suggest a degree of resentment for what was being said. And I think that struck me so much that I'm actually writing about it now in my thesis. So,
what are your thoughts about the recent media attention your research has received? Is it an isolated case, or is the MMO and gaming community in general getting more credibility?
when I was first approached by the media, in this case the BBC, for an interview, I'll admit I was actually very surprised to the degree where I googled the correspondent for the BBC who contacted me to make sure he was legitimate, because I just assumed someone was just playing a joke on me. That was the degree to which I just assumed that the media wasn't all that interested in raiding or games unless it has something negative attached to it. So if I was researching the negative health effects of raiding, that I would probably get more attention from the media than if I was just doing what I am doing, which is just studying it for the sake of studying it and trying to document what's going on. So yes, I will say that at first my thoughts were very surprised and a bit confused. However, and actually, just to add to that, when I first did the interview, I spent about a day or two collecting all of my literature that I had been reading and collecting, where, talking about games and the positive effects of games and some various other things to try and sort of present the case for games being more than just one-sided. And just to qualify myself there, everything in moderation is always the best approach. And of course, there are elements of raiding that can be very, very intensive and can actually be very bad for our health. And I don't subscribe to the idea that that raiding in and of itself is good or bad. I think it's just what it is, and you yourself as an individual raider need to decide what's good and bad for you based on your life and your family and everything that's going on. But for the most part, my experience with what the media had reported was primarily focused on just the negative, without any consideration for the other things that are going on as well. So I came into that interview expecting to be asked the typical questions about, well, isn't it bad, and aren't we seeing a rise in violence from children who play video games and things of that nature. None of those questions came up. I was just asked, how does raiding work? What's usually going on? How do groups work together? So I was very pleasantly surprised. And the same thing came through when they did the interview, for the actual article that was written up as well. It was very much a factual representation of what's going on and what I'm doing, particularly in my research. I think it's a sign of something good. I think as we have an increasingly large community that is interested in games, and it's not just MMOs, but other types of games as well, that it does start to shift perceptions a little bit. And I think as people are starting to understand, and there's more data becoming available, that gamers are not necessarily strictly male, they're not strictly teenaged, they're not strictly of a certain socioeconomic background or educational background. I think it does slowly start to change perceptions, and I think gaming may never become, really well loved and sort of reported on by the media, but I think some of the sort of a tendency to jump to the negative will slowly start to change. In fact, there is another story that we're developing right now that I'm doing with the media, just to kind of give a bit more specific overview of how a raid works. And it's also, I would say, a bit more like a documentary than it is a sort of expose type media piece. So again, maybe this is signaling something positive. The best we can do is just keep talking about things and share that information and just see what happens.
So what are you hoping to achieve with your research?
I suppose my number one priority for the impact of my research is to hopefully get a job, of course. Any PhD student will attest to this. When you get towards the end of your degree, you're very eager to move on to the next stage in your professional life. Luckily for me, I think one of the nice things about doing research into games is it allows you to look at different ways to do professional work afterwards, work in academia or continue working in the private sector and so on. And I think games sort of typify that kind of versatile approach to work, which I think is where we're evolving in general as people go and as work goes. But I know that's not really what you're interested in finding out. You want to know the overall impact that I'm hoping to have with my research. Every researcher hopes that their work will be taken seriously and it will trigger further research. That is really of course, my aspiration and my goal. I would love to see more work being done on testing some of my theories about group dynamics. I'd love to see it looked at from the perspective of education, from management, business environments, work environments, and so on. I think there is something to be understood and tested from a game experience and put in those sorts of settings. For example, perhaps large-scale group activities in a work environment where people have to work on large projects together. There has been some work done about that, and I think perhaps we can apply some of the the team building skills and sort of ideas of social interaction that come from being in raiding guilds, for example. Maybe there's a way for us to think about that in other environments, and I'd love to see that being tested further, either through postdoctoral research or through working with other researchers. I do know that even though there's not been a lot done yet, there is a lot of interest that's been growing about doing research into raiding and World of Warcraft and other games like World of Warcraft. So I'd love to see again that happening some more, and this triggering more interest in that area. And I think too, on a sort of related level, one thing that I'd love to see people thinking about is perhaps having a better perspective on what raiding really is, on how these games work, which is why my priority when I finish is actually to complete the book that I had originally brought me to my research. The world does need to understand, what raiding is, how it works, how games are, and that there is a lot more going on than just someone pushing buttons on a computer screen and staring, what appears to be staring mindlessly at a screen. There's actually a lot of activity, there's a lot of interaction, and I think a book would really help that. So that's another one of my main goals. I think also if somehow my research or something that comes out of it could take the pressure off of some individual who just likes to do gaming for their idea of free time. This is what they like to do when they have a few hours off in the evening. Instead of, say, watching television for 3 hours, they'd rather be in a raid. I think it would be nice for this to be seen, or at least regarded as an acceptable activity. It can still be seen as a controversial at this point for some people, and I think it has put off others from playing and has actually caused, especially I think among some of the younger raiders out there, an idea of a social stigma, although they're not quite accepted. And for some individuals, they will very, very actively hide the fact that they play a game, which I think is quite comical on some level, and also quite sad as well, that they feel that they have to hide the fact that they play a game. And it would be nice to see in time, again, perhaps with the media's help and books and things of that sort, that things would potentially improve in that area. So yes, those are some of the hopes I'm having, hopes that I have rather, in regards to my research.